All right, jewelry peeps, I'm gonna have you pause and I wanna go over how the measuring works. And I'm filming this right now, so then I'll put it on Schoology. So if you're not here and you wanna watch this on Schoology yourself tomorrow, I'm okay with that. But if you are trying to watch this, just make sure your AirPods are out and your phone's down. So I have grid paper just because I like working on grid paper when I'm measuring. You don't have to. I could even like cut out a little chunk and put it on my regular sketch paper if I want. But I've got a few sketches here of like different, I just drew like focal point designs for a ring. And then ultimately I'm going to lay it out kind of what I have here on the right, but I'm going to walk you through it. On the back of your handout, it's got the steps here. So your first step is going to be measuring your ring size. I'm going to take off one of my rings so I can measure. And this needs to be a lot more precise than what we did in level 1 because we had that opening where we could kind of squeeze it tighter if it was a little bit too big. Now we want to make sure we're really on it. So I know the numbers are hard to see here, but in our ring sizers, these are in the measuring tools drawer of the red toolbox up front. There's the numbers that have a little dash next to it. That's a half size. And then if you can't tell what number it is, just check what's next to it because these are all in order. So I'm gonna try, this is a 9.5. It's a little bit big, so I'm gonna go down to a 9 and then try that on. I'm trying to find one for my middle finger on my left hand. So that feels pretty good. So I'm gonna go off of a size 9. And for me, I have like the attention span of a like tiny little adorable frog. So I'm gonna write these things down so I don't forget. So I usually will do it on my sketch and I'll say size 9 and then you're gonna look at a crazy chart and I'm gonna walk you through this and let me actually do a dry erase marker so you guys can see what I'm marking on here and follow along. Well, if I had a dry erase marker, I'll just point. So this crazy chart is also in the measuring tools drawer. And with this, what you're looking at is you're looking at the sizes of rings on the left column and then the gauge of your metal on the top row. So depending on how thick your metal is, it's gonna need a slightly different length to wrap around your finger. So before you get to this crazy chart, pick out your metal. I have a piece of brass here and I wanna check the gauge because since we are gonna be soldering it edge to edge, we don't want metal that's too thin. I would say no thinner than 20 gauge when you're finding your metal. And then also in the measuring tools drawer, you guys are basically gonna get everything you need from that drawer. I have our gauge tool. Make sure you're reading the side that has the logo on it of general. And when you are finding a fit, you go through and you find the slot that is most snug on your metal. And I actually think I have size 20. Most of our metal in here is either 18 gauge or 20, but there's a few pieces that are thinner and then it's really hard to solder when they're not very thick. So I've got size 20 gauge here because I can't fit it into 21. Gauges, remember, are kind of funky because the higher the number, the smaller your metal is, so it's the opposite. So I've got gauge 20, so I'm gonna go back to my sheet real quick, and before I forget anything else, I'm gonna write that down. And I want you to tell me what metal type. So I wrote brass since that's what I have. And then if you forget the metal types, I have a few pieces that I labeled the metal type on the desk up front for my level 1. Feel free to sneak a peek at that so you can refresh yourself. Now I go to the crazy chart. So I know that I've got size 9, gauge 20. So I'm gonna go down to size 9 here. And then my gauges here, so if I follow it down from gauge 20, it's 61.5. So this is 61.5 millimeters. And then we are ultimately going to add a little bit of extra length on here. That's what I write in here. I say add 5 millimeters. All that we're really doing is because our ends need to be parallel so we have a good connection, if we have extra length, we can overlap them when we're done sawing it and then cut them off in one fluid motion so that connection is parallel. Filing the two ends separately is a lot harder. So it can be around 5 millimeters, whatever works for your design if you need to go less or more than that. So I'm gonna do all of this just laid out, so if I come back to it later, it makes sense to me. And I'll ask you guys to do it laid out like this so it makes sense to me when I'm grading it. So I'm gonna add 5 millimeters on each end, so I'm gonna add plus 10, and then that gives me 71.5 millimeters. Woo, that turned into a mutant M. So this is where the graph paper is really helpful, and you could do this all on graph paper if you wanted, but I'm going to map out, and I'm doing this in red so you guys can see. I would recommend doing it in pencil in case you need to adjust things. But you've got our ruler from up front that has inches on one side, the centimeters and millimeters on the other side. We also have small rulers in our measuring tools drawer that are made for jewelry, so they're just a little less clunky if you want to use these. They also have inches on one side, centimeters and millimeters on the other. And then reminder for you with millimeters that millimeters are 10 per centimeter. So if I'm going to 71.5 millimeters, then I'm basically just doing right over 7 centimeters on my ruler. So I'm gonna mark, and I'm gonna mark my 5 millimeter point of extra, and I always end up coming back to my ideas and getting confused, so I'm even gonna label that. And I'm gonna go to 71, and that 0.5 is so small that if I don't get that exactly, that's okay. And then I'm gonna mark my extra 5 here, and just remind myself that that's extra. And then I like the grid paper because what I can do is I can pull this down. This is really if you're drawing multiples. You don't have to do this, but you totally could if it helps. But I like to set mine up this way because then I have a whole column. I'm going to pull down my markers for where the band extra length is so I don't have anything important in my design that I accidentally end up cutting off. But I'm going to pull that down, and then what I have is a column that I can work in for my designs. So I'm going to keep working in a colored marker so you guys can see, but I'm going to switch to a different color. So I've got purple here that I can draw in. And then at this point, if my design is the one that I told you all not to do of just this basic circle, what I can start to do now is I can start to draw that out, and the center of my design will be in the center of this. So when we did this in level 1, you had to have your ends of your ring on the opposite sides, and it was kind of tricky. This is actually easier, but what I like to do if I'm feeling real specific and wanting to make sure things are symmetrical is I'll even mark, like for my ring itself, I'm just over 61, which let me make sure, yeah, I got that, makes sense for my math. So I'm gonna do right around the halfway point, make myself a mark, and then if I want to be super exact, I'll even measure my finger, because I've done this before where I make like a center point on my ring that's too wide and it wraps over my finger. So my finger is 20 millimeters wide. So then if I have my middle point here, then what I can do is I can mark 20 millimeters wide for my finger, and then because I'm me, I'm going to label this so I don't get confused. Finger width. You don't have to get this intense with it, but if you want to make sure that things are going to fit on your finger, that's not a bad move. And then what I can do is I can start to map things out. So I can use my grid line. This is where pencil would be ideal. I can know that following down those lines that I marked for my finger width are a good guideline to know that my design is going to fit on the top of my finger. And then I actually don't want that band because I did it a little high. Then I can kind of follow my grid lines to make sure that things are straight. Use a stencil at this point if you want. Use the ruler for a straight edge. I'm just kind of freewheeling it here. So if I was in pencil, I'd be able to go over this with pen or erase and tighten things up. And then if I want like a negative space like I had sketched out, I can map this out. But basically at the end, once I have this all tightly rendered, I'm going to end up with these sections that I'm shading in now as extra length. So make sure those aren't important parts of your design, because this is what we're going to end up sacrificing once we have things cut out to make sure that we have a really parallel connection point. So for you, what I'm looking for on your sketch is basically what you all have now of your ideas. Obviously the research board is part of the plan, but then whichever design you're doing, I want it mapped out with your length labeled. So I've got one here. This is another example I did years ago where I had like my size, the gauge, the length, and then I had it laid out. But on this version, I didn't do the extra length, and that semester we all had to try to file it, and it was a pain. So make sure you have that extra length on each side and know that that part's gonna end up getting cut off, so don't make it anything that's really important to yours. Just like in Jewelry 1, if you wanna be really careful and make sure this fits, you could trace this in tracing paper and then wrap it around your finger. And since the tracing paper is so much thinner than your metal, it's probably gonna be a little loose, and that's totally fine. But that way you can check that it's not too small. Does that make sense for people? Okay, I recorded this. I'm gonna end it.